Go ahead.
All right, welcome everybody. Apologize for the green screen. I always forget what my last setting is. So thanks for joining the asset management webinar. My name is Mike Gomez. I'm an ITAM solution consultant. I also have with me Mika Anderson. Mika, would you like to say hello?
Yeah, thanks, Mike. Hi, everyone. I'm also an ITAM solution consultant. I've been with ServiceNow for about 2 years now and working on IT asset management for the past few months.
Excellent, thank you. So yeah, it's great to have everybody. And also Annie just joined as well. She's another our ITAM solution consultant. So everybody's here. We actually are having a few webinars coming up this month. So next week, we'll be talking about the asset management workspace. And then the following week, Annie's going to be taking us through sort of in the reclamation process. Annie, did you want to mention anything about that? Sorry to put you on the spot.
That's all right. Yeah, the talk on the 21st will be asset reclamation, prioritized around the better together story between ITAM and HRSD and the onboarding and offboarding process.
Great, thanks, Annie. All right, so let's go ahead and get started with asset management. And I should say for all these that we are recording these webinars, and we'll make sure you have a copy of the recording afterwards, and might even try to kind of post these somewhere all together so you can get to them later. All right, so with that, just give you a quick overview here. Basically, I'm just going to spend a few minutes going over like ITAM goals in general, and then the specific solution. And then we'll spend most of the time in the demo. And I want to make sure I leave time at the end. We can talk about some of the other ITAM products and just do kind of a general Q&A. I'm just seeing a chat. I'm not seeing a Q&A panel. So I think we're just going to be answering questions in the chat, which is fine. And I think, if you have questions, we'll try to answer them as we go. And then we'll also leave time at the end. And we can kind of highlight the important ones. And then if you don't get your question answered, maybe we can try to follow up on the community afterwards. All right. So just, quick overview about ITAM goals. And I really tried to simplify this, but on the left here, the sort of three kind of high level ITAM goals that you can think of. First is around just like understanding total cost of ownership. So not just, what you paid for a laptop, but also all the contracts, maintenance agreements, all the cost information, understanding that. And by having that in ServiceNow, we have like the operational information, right? And that's kind of this section over here, which is, typically your change management. And kind of what I'm highlighting with this illustration is that you have a lot of the asset processes here at the bottom. We're requesting things, we're receiving them, we're putting them in stock. And then once they're in stock, we're going to deploy them. And that's kind of where the change management, configuration management kind of takes over. But what I want to highlight is that asset management encompasses all of this, right? As things are in service, we need to understand that. And ServiceNow is has great operational info and can really tie everything together. So that's one piece. The other is just around user productivity. So just making sure that people can easily get the things they need, that we know what people have been assigned, all that information. And then the final piece is around policy. So, if you have a refresh policy, maybe every 3 years, somebody needs a new laptop, right? You need data in order to enforce that. And so with ServiceNow, we have both the data and the automation to make that, that policy work in real life. All right, so I know there's a lot to this slide, and I'm not going to dig into all of it, but I usually show this slide when I'm talking about this hardware asset management product. So just to kind of break it down, basically, today I'm going to be talking about asset management. And you may have heard us refer to this in a few different ways, but basically this is the asset management module that's been a part of ServiceNow since Berlin, which I believe was 2012. So, my goal in this call is to make sure that you're clear on, a lot of these features here and just have a really solid understanding of them. That's what I'm going to be spending the bulk of the time. But I do want to call out that there is now hardware asset management. And this is a new product that we released, relatively new, that we released in 2020, that adds automation on top of the base asset management module. So you may have heard us refer to this like different ways. So sometimes we'll throw a base in front of this just to kind of clarify, or you might hear ITSM asset management, but we don't like to call it that because you also get asset management with CSM. Basically, this asset management module is like a core module. And hardware asset management, you might have heard us kind of throw a pro afterwards because it is an additional module. So just want to kind of clarify, but these are the ideal kind of naming. All right. So I think with that, we can kind of jump in and take a look at an instance. So I am going to be showing you our new next experience. But if this looks a little unfamiliar to you, no worries. I'm just trying to kind of modernize. I tried to modernize my slides a little bit. I don't know how well I did, but yeah. So the first thing I want to talk about. So we're on the hardware table, and basically what you're going to have here are your different, like what we call serialized assets. So individual assets that are going to have some kind of unique identifier. So let's take a look. In like high level stuff, you want to see every asset's going to have a model, some type of hardware that it's an instance of. It could be assigned to somebody, or if it's like a server or network gear, it might not be, but it would still be in use. And then other assets could be in stock. They're going to have a location associated with them. And then the big thing is they're going to be tied to a configuration item. And this, like I said, is more of the operational info. So let's take a look at an asset record and kind of get a sense of just the different information that you can track on one. So with our kind of general tab, again, high level information, the department, the company it's associated with, when it was assigned to the end user. this installed would be like if it weren't assigned to individual people, but just like if it was network gear, like when was it put into service? When we get into the financial piece, so you're going to sort of see how this comes into play, but this is big. So this is the purchase tied to like the purchase record of how we procured this asset. You know, how much is it worth? Who did we buy it from? This is kind of like bringing in that procurement information and tying it to that physical device on the network. For disposal, you could track like based on when it was installed, what's the scheduled retirement, and then, you know, make sure that it's retired close to when it's scheduled. So with depreciation, we have that cost information I mentioned from the financial tab. And then you can, you know, when it was installed, that would be like the effective date in most cases. You can have a depreciation schedule that usually comes from the model. I'll show you how that ties in. So it's like straight line depreciation, 3 years. So we can figure out basically the residual value of this asset. We run this job every night that's going to calculate like the depreciated amount. So of course your accountants are going to be doing depreciation, but the idea here is that we know what's in use, so we'll be able to calculate it more accurately, just as long as we have the data that we need. So this could kind of be a check against, you know, what's in your books, and, you know, potentially if you could save money in some cases if we're able to, you know, depreciate things more accurately. You can also tie your assets to contracts. So this would be like when the asset is end of warranty by the manufacturer, but then you could also tie it to a maintenance contract. I'll show you the maintenance contracts in a little bit more detail. And then assets can be tied to licenses. So you might have within project entitlement that's per device. So you could say like this, we're going to consume one license for this entitlement. You could explicitly say that. There's other ways of kind of figuring this out. All right, and then of course, like as the asset goes through its life cycle, you can track the changes. So in this case, we're tracking like the state and who it's assigned to. This is looking at like the audit table. So you could potentially track other fields as well as they change. All right, so that is the asset table, and I wanted to show you the CI. So again, this is tied to, it's the same device, but we're just looking at it in 2 different ways. So this CI actually is, I brought this in from like SCCM. So you can see the discovery source is SCCM, and that is a free service graph connector. You do have to request it, but you can pull in devices from SCCM into ServiceNow. And if the serial number matches what's in your procurement records, if it matches the asset records, then we'll tie it to that asset. And that's a really powerful combination, and it's a great reason for bringing data into ServiceNow from SCCM. So we can see kind of high level information about the device, and then SCCM can also bring in software installations. So I have the SAM Foundation module turned on, so that's why the installs kind of look the way they do, and I'll show you the difference. But I should mention in this instance, I don't have any paid ITAM products turned on, just so that we're kind of clear on what you get on the base module. All right, so that is the asset and the CI. So the next thing I wanted to look at was Stockrooms. So if we go to our Stockrooms, basically this is going to be where things, you know, just where things are that aren't in service. So they might be pending deployment, or it could be they're disposed of and we're preparing to get rid of them, but it's basically a staging area. And it doesn't have to be a warehouse. I know I'm showing you a warehouse here, but it just could be any place in your company where things are not being used. So it's going to break it out by those individual serialized assets, and then also the consumables. So these behave a slightly different way. So let's take a look at one of these records. Basically with a consumable, it's like a bulk item. So I have like 100 Cat5 cables, it's just one record. And you can see here the total cost of that. But what I can do is I can consume it against an asset. So let's say we were going to consume it against that, that laptop I just showed you. You could also tie it to a user as well. But I'm going to basically pull one of these cables out of stock and assign it to that device. And you'll see when it does that, it decrements the quantity. And it also creates another record. It'll basically create, you can actually see it this way. It's basically going to create a new record here tied to the asset. So it definitely behaves in a kind of different way where you're, as you are using this record, you're creating new records. But if we go to the laptop here and go to our general tab, now we can see that that consumable is tied to the asset. And it's using like a parent-child relationship. Excuse me, let me just take a quick drink of water. So like here, I could have this asset tied to another asset. That was the parent, but in this case, that's sort of the way that the consumables work. Right, and I should mention that there are two mobile applications and there are features. So these are included with the platform. And there are asset management features in both. So while we're kind of on the subject of looking at the asset record, I wanted to show you another way. So this would be for your end users. But what this essentially allows them to do is go into their phone and see what they've been assigned. And they could go into their phone and report an issue right against the asset, or it would be the CI, but they can do it right from their phone. So you have that capability just with the base module. You just would need to roll it out to your end users. I'm going to go into the agent one in a little bit when we talk about the purchase orders. Okay, so that is around the asset. So it's great to have all that information, right? But I think the next step is to sort of look at like, how do we make this a little more dynamic, right? So it's good to have an inventory, but there's a lot of different ways you could have an inventory. So here are some of the benefits of having this in ServiceNow. So if we were, like I said, every asset is going to be tied to a model. So you can see here are the different Lenovos that I have at in this company. And I wanted to show you this one. So basically with these models, you're sort of tracking, it's a template that we're going to create the assets from. So I mentioned the sort of the four things that you want to track is the manufacturer, the name, model number, and the model category. This is like the type of asset that it is. So if you have those filled in, like that's great to start, and then on top of that, if you have the useful life, the way this works is if we look at when the asset was created, and then we look at the useful life, and based on the date, we'll flag it if it's eligible for refresh. So that's one benefit of tracking this. I mentioned the depreciation, so this is going to get copied down to the asset when we create it. And you can flag some models as being certified. So maybe there's some that we want to make available to our employees, and others are, maybe they're just in use now, but we want to move away from them. And then the final thing you can do is publish your models to the service catalog. So you don't have to publish all of them, but the ones that you want to make available for people to request, you would just sort of fill in the information here. And the link is not here because I've already published it, but this is sort of how I did it. And then when you publish it, it'll generate a record in another table called the catalog item table. And this is where you would go in and set like the flow that determines what happens when somebody requests it. So this workflow is actually included out of the box. And just to show you a few of these workflows. So there's going to be one workflow that's just for the request in general. And you're going to see this in action in a minute. But basically, like if it's less than some, $1,000, we can just automatically approve it. But If it's more than that, then it's going to go to a group. And of course, you can absolutely customize this. So that's the flow for the entire request. And then here's that hardware flow that I just showed you. This is like what actually happens when somebody requests it. I do want to call out that this is built in our older kind of workflow engine. We have a newer engine called Flow Designer, and that's a HAM professional benefit. Is we've done a similar thing with the request process. We've added some other automation and things around it, but just want to call that out, that you do get this out of the box with Asset. All right, so yeah, let's take a look at requesting a couple of assets. So if I come in here to this model that I published, you can see all the information I showed you in that other screen, and your employees, they could, potentially request multiple items. You could package these items up into an order guides. You could also just like add it to the cart so that you could have multiple items in the cart. But in this case, I'm just going to submit a request for one item. And so I want to show you kind of in the back end what happens with this request. So we've got a request for 2 laptops. If we go into our favorites here, we'll see the request. So this was over the threshold. So it's the first thing that's going to happen is it's going to create this approval step. So Eric is a member of the approvers group, and we can definitely adjust who is in that group, but Darren's an admin, so he's just going to override this to keep it moving. But basically, so one thing I should mention is that depending on there's a procurement plugin, and if you have that plugin turned on, 2 different things are going to happen. So we do have this procurement plugin. It's not turned on by default. It is free, so you do need to request it. But that's what's going to let you do that integration with receiving against the PO and just bringing in that cost information. So I encourage you to, if you don't have it turned on now, take a look at it in subprod, and if you like what it does, it might make sense to turn it on. But basically, because it is on, we're going to kind of go through a different path. And basically, that path is to create a catalog task to source this request. So if we come in here, it's going to get assigned to procurement. You might want this to go to a different group, like maybe asset management, because we don't necessarily know that we're going to buy it. But you can see I don't have any in stock, but potentially if I had more of this available, I could transfer it from another place. But what I'm going to do is just purchase it. So when I created this model, it created a vendor for Lenovo, but you could potentially have multiple vendors, maybe like a reseller. So you're just saying there who you're going to purchase it from and then where it's going to be delivered. So we'll submit that. So you can see, sorry, went a little fast there, but it generated a purchase order. So now we have a record in this table, and this is kind of like a shell PO. So, in an implementation, typically you're not going to be, sending POs from ServiceNow, but this is kind of a skeleton PO. It's a place for you to pull in information from a procurement system. We don't offer those integrations out of the box with the base asset management. Integration Hub does have a number of procurement integrations with procurement systems. That is an additional product. But that's the idea, is like, okay, we've had this request, we decided that we're going to purchase, and now we have the record of information about that purchase. And what's key for asset management is the cost information and the details of when we purchased it. So it's in this requested state. I have one line item. I could potentially have multiple line items on this purchase order. I'm going to do order. And now, so we can imagine we've cut the PO, we've paid them, or maybe we haven't paid them yet, but at least we've signaled that we're ready to kind of move forward with this purchase. So the next step is to receive it. So there's a few different ways that you can receive it. I'm going to show you the mobile application. So let me just kind of back up here. So I went to the agent mobile application. And these are the features that are available for your agents with the base asset management. So they could create an asset from their phone, maybe if they were in the field. It does use, a lot of this uses the scanning capability of the camera. They could look up an asset as well, just by the asset tag. I could even look up one that we know exists. And you could have this just do serial number instead. It would just be, you just have to kind of change the configuration. But you can say it looked up that asset, and you can change what fields you make available here too. And then the final piece that I wanted to show you is around the receiving the PO. So here we have the 10, this is the most recent one. So if I come in here to our PO line items, I have 2, should be able to. So I'm going to scan these. And so the idea here is that I'm capturing the serial number and asset tag. Like we're basically assuming in this scenario that I didn't know what they were. But one thing customers do is they'll get like an advanced ship notice from their vendor. And you could, instead of capturing that information, you could do like a check. Are these the asset tags and serial numbers that we expected? Or maybe we know the serial number, but we don't know the asset tag yet. So a lot of different possibilities. But basically, this is going with that information, we're able to generate the assets. So if we come back to our instance here, we'll see these assets created. And it used, basically what it did is it used information from the request, from this PO record, and then that information we added, and it created the asset. And you can see once all the line items on the PO are received, then the entire PO goes to received. So if we take a look at that asset record now, so all of this kind of got filled in by ServiceNow. You can see, the assigned got filled in. With the financial, we have the request, the purchase order line, who the vendor was, the disposal, that did not get calculated, but that's something you could maybe do as part of like a business rule. We got the depreciation in there. So a lot of useful information kind of gets captured by going through that process. Right. All right, so that's kind of the procurement piece that I wanted to cover. I've covered around the mobile applications, the receiving. Let's talk a little bit about contracts. So
hey Mike, before we continue on to contracts, do we want to pause really quick for some questions?
Yeah, sure.
All right.
You want to read some out that you?
Yeah, so one of the questions, is this flow in Flow Designer?
Yeah, so it's not in Flow Designer. It's only in the workflow, but there is a version with hardware asset management, HAM Pro, that is built in Flow Designer. So if you wanted that, you would have to purchase HAM Pro.
And then one more question. Which version is this? Are we looking specifically at HAM Pro, or are we looking into the ITAM base asset management instance?
Yeah, great question. So this is all base asset management. Yeah. I see somebody has their hand raised. I don't know if that was because there's a follow-up to my other answer.
Another question from Ravi. Can we do the receiving through ServiceNow UI instead of the mobile app?
Yeah, absolutely. So I don't know if it's going to let me do it, but you can do the receiving from the UI. It's basically very similar, where you can type in the, let's just go back to the PO, where you can type in the asset tag and serial number. And another thing too that you might do is actually, let's go to a completed one. You could kind of import against this receiving. So you see, like when you receive it, it generates a receiving slip. So if you didn't want to use the mobile application, if you have your own scanner, basically what you do is kind of capture the asset tags and serial numbers and then send them to ServiceNow, there's like a function. If you kind of dig into this purchase order, you'll see there's a function about, create receiving slips. And if it has the asset tag and serial number, it'll create these entries and generate the assets. So there's a lot of different ways to do it. Yeah. All right. Those were I know there's a lot of questions coming in, but if you want, we can probably answer one more if you think.
Yeah, let me just scroll through. There's a ton of questions.
Yeah.
For the SCCM ingest feature to work, does this work with standard or ITSM Pro?
That should work with standard. Yep. I just have standard, and yep, you just need to request the service graph connector. That's kind of the way we do it. We use this new service graph connector, and you just go through the guided setup. Of course, make sure do it in subprod, but yeah, you don't need pro to do the service graph connector. This is the one service graph connector, might be the only one I think that is, you don't need an ITAM or ITAM license.
Got it. And then as we continue on with the session, we'll continue to look at the chat for any questions that continue to come in. But
okay,
Mike, feel free to continue on and we'll moderate.
No problem. All right, so when we're talking about contracts, so like the idea is not to really do all of your contract management in ServiceNow, but there is a benefit of bringing these in. So let's take a look at the this maintenance contract. I guess before we do that, just high level information. So there's a contract number. So this would be like the number in your contract system, but then there's also a contract number that just gets generated in ServiceNow. There's the vendor, some description of the contract, when the start and end dates are, and then we have this like state. So we have just like in asset management, we have different states for where the contract's at. And if something is expiring or expired, we can send you notifications about that. So that's kind of what this expiration column means. But yeah, if we kind of dig into this contract, basically the real benefit of doing this is this kind of related list down here, assets covered. So, this basically lets me see here are all my assets that are associated with this contract. And if you have something like a maintenance contract, typically you're going to pay some fixed monthly amount, and of course your arrangement could vary, but you're going to pay some kind of standard amount, and then you're going to have assets tied to it. And a challenge that customers have is they'll kind of set this up, but then they'll lose track of what happens with the assets. And sometimes people will keep paying maintenance, or maybe it's a lease on assets that aren't even in service anymore. So this is sort of the main reason why, of doing this in ServiceNow, pulling all this information in. And so we know if something happens, if the asset gets retired or there's an incident against it, we need to make sure that we update the contract. And because it's all in one place, it's really easy to do that. So basically you can see here, this is my payment amount. It's monthly. So another thing you can do, and this kind of gets into the total cost of ownership thing, is once I know that these assets are associated with the contract, we have this concept of like a rate card. So this basically generates what we call expense lines. So actually, before I show you the expense line on the contract, let me just show you an expense line on an asset. So if we look at this one that I showed you before, every time you create an asset, it will create an expense line. So, and it will just be for the cost of the asset. So it's not like it'll be a one-time cost just tied to that cost field I showed you up there. It's not going to take into consideration taxes necessarily unless that's included in this amount. So this definitely isn't the whole picture. Let me just take a, all right. So if we go back to that contract, so we have we have an expense line for the asset, but then there's going to be an expense line for the contract. And what the rate cards let us do is sort of split that up against the different assets on the contract. So you notice that I have 5 assets here. This is when I added them. So these 3 Lenovo's laptops, I just added them yesterday and today. So they're not going to get counted in the expense lines yet because this runs on like a monthly basis. So next month they'll be included. And basically what this lets me do is like spread the cost of this contract across all of the assets on the contract. And you can change the way that this works, the behavior, like in a way that makes sense to you. So maybe you just want to do it, just be, $100 for each one. But in this case, what I did is I did it based on the value of the asset. So if we look here at the expense lines, this ThinkStation is more expensive than this other one. So the amounts, the way we split up the contract was the monthly payment was different. So, you can do it however kind of works for you, but basically what this is going to do is generate expense lines that you can then tie back to the asset. And if we can sum up all, let's take a look at the expense line. We can kind of sum up all those expense lines and get a picture of the cost of ownership. So you can see a bunch of things being referenced here. We have the asset, the contract, the amount. So there's a lot of good financial information here that can help you figure out kind of total cost of ownership for this device. All right, so yeah, that's a lot of the base asset. And I guess maybe just to recap, I hope this kind of left you with an understanding of kind of what these things mean. We didn't talk too much about transfer orders, but they're very similar to purchase orders. I'm just basically moving stock from one stockroom to another. So I didn't go into a lot of detail about that. But, there's a lot that you can do here is kind of the bottom line, and you can track hardware with the base asset management. I guess, just to sum up again, really where HAM Pro or hardware asset management comes in is with the different workflows. So rather in the past, when customers have been implementing HAM, they've had to create a lot of these flows themselves and our partners as well. So what we're offering here is sort of like a standard set of flows, and you can copy them, adjust them the way that you need to. And, you'll sort of be in a good spot as far as like upgrades and sort of doing things the way that ServiceNow expects them to work. So that's a big piece. There's also the content library. So like I showed you those models, they looked pretty clean in that instance, but as these models can get generated by discovery, like every model, even a CI is going to have a model associated with it. So by having this normalization, we're going to try to recognize as many models as we can and clean up the names. We'll categorize everything. We'll pull in the lifecycle dates. So I won't go through like every HAM feature here, but I want you to kind of understand just high level some of the differences. And then just the final piece I'll call out is around the mobile capabilities. So you can do like a mobile audit, go into a stock room or a location and scan what's there. And if it's not where we expect it to be, we'll automatically update it. So yeah, a lot of great capabilities. All right, let's talk a little bit about software. So I know I kind of touched on it briefly, but, and this actually, it's worth kind of going back to the slide. So there's kind of 2 products when it comes to software. We have SAM Foundation, and this one is free, but again, you do have to like request it and turn it on. And, I'll go into this in a little bit more, but it does, like one thing kind of right off the bat is it will update the software install table. And this is important point. So let me show you that. So basically in this instance here, I don't have like any, I don't have SAM Foundation turned on. So when I have it set up that way, you have this CMDB CI software package basically. And so you have a package, you got the version, the manufacturer, the name, and then how many, like a count of how many installs there are. And then here are the devices that it's installed on. So those are kind of like the 2 the two records. You have like a sort of summary record, and then you have the individual, like a list of the devices that it's installed on. When you turn on HAM Foundation, it changes the way that we do the reporting. So it basically moves those entries to a different table. You can see this one's SAM software install. And this lets you track it in a more fine-grained way, I would say. So you have an entry for each software. You have a discovery model, which is like a grouping of these unique combinations of name, publisher, and version. And then, so it just kind of splits everything out and you just have one table. So that is, an important change to be aware of. And this is, I would say that this way of looking at it is a little more useful. The other way is fine, but if you really want to kind of dig into SAM, this is sort of worth looking into. And one thing that I'll mention with SAM Foundation is like the idea is you have these, what we've discovered, and then we're going to map it to what, a more standard version. And then that's, we can tie this to a license. That's kind of the idea of why we're doing it this way. And you'll see that this is manually normalized. So the challenge with SAM Foundation is that you have to manually normalize all the discovery models. Whereas with SAM Pro, we have a library of these mappings, and we're constantly updating that library. So you wouldn't have to go in and manually clean these up. But doing this mapping is really important for tying your software to licenses. But yeah, so I wanted to make sure that was clear. And then you can see like all of these installation records that kind of roll up to this discovery model. So I know it's like in the weeds a little bit, but I think it's an important point. So, and the last thing too, I'll mention with SAM Foundation. And so you might say, okay, well, that's great. That sounds good to me. But the challenge with SAM Foundation, like I mentioned, the manual normalization, as soon as you want to start entering entitlements, SAM Foundation becomes a little problematic because entering entitlements takes a lot of work, with any tool that you use. So if you were to enter it here, the problem is that we only have a few metrics. These are just different ways of measuring usage. So we have like per device, per user. So if you were to enter a bunch of metrics here, you'd be really limiting yourself if you did plan on using reconciliation, because if you were to turn on SAM Pro, you get a ton more metrics. There's a lot of custom stuff that you wouldn't need to do. And then you have to go and kind of rework everything. So that would just create a lot of work. So if you really think that you're going to be doing any kind of license reconciliation, I don't advise really using SAM Foundation, because you're just setting yourself up for more work in the future. You're quickly going to outgrow it. And then, you'll be kind of catching up. So just wanted to, those are two main things I wanted to call out, is the install table. I think that is helpful, but I think there is a challenge around the entitlements. That's kind of what I'm just summarizing with this slide, that with SAM Foundation, you get the install table, you get the ability to store these licenses, you get some like basic reconciliation, but there's a lot that you're kind of missing out. And then when we talk about SAM Professional, again, I won't go through all the features, but you'll get the normalization, a lot of the reporting, you get performance analytics with both SAM and HAM. You get your integrations with software asset management. With SaaS license management. The SAM Foundation doesn't have any SaaS integrations, and also spend detection and a lot of great features. So hopefully that kind of helps you make sense of the two, the SAM Foundation and SAM Professional. I'm just looking at time. And then again, this is just like kind of summarizing what I mentioned. I should call out too that we have another offering called SAM Enterprise that was released in Quebec, and it includes cloud insights. So this is around managing your public cloud spend, like in Azure and AWS. There could be virtual machines that your developers are spinning up, And Cloud Insights helps you pull in the billing data, get those devices assigned to groups, and help you kind of just get control of your cloud spend and kind of govern that environment. And there's also a feature around normalization. So I mentioned we have those rules with SAM Pro. SAM Enterprise kind of kicks up a notch and looks at, like, even if we don't have a rule, it will take a guess, and then it will constantly like learn from those guesses and improve the mappings. And there's some, like our content team will review kind of what it does and try to improve it. Right.
Hey, Mike, we have some questions in the chat.
Yeah.
Which is a perfect time to lead into Q&A.
Sure.
Regarding SAM, is there one configuration item created for MS Project? In this case, is it a one-to-one relationship with the install, or is it one-to-many devices?
Yeah, it's a good question. So the way we handle installs it's sort of interesting. So it's not necessarily a configuration item with the base, like without any kind of SAM foundation. I guess it technically is like you have the CI, but basically you have the way we do it is you have the package. So this CI like represents a grouping of them, and then you'll have like another entry that maps the device to the grouping. So that's kind of the way we do it. I think if we look at this, it might show us it's called like a software instance. And you can see this is it's not like doesn't inherit from the CMDB CI. So that's kind of the way that it's architected in the base, or just without SAM Foundation. And then if you have SAM Foundation, you basically have one entry for every device. So like, and it's not technically doesn't inherit from CMDB CI, but yeah, you'll have like an individual entry for each device. So it is a little different the way that in each system, but hopefully that answers the question.
Thanks, Mike. Another question that is popping up in the chat: is there a way to determine license types for service provider companies? Example, what is used internally versus what is resold?
License type for companies. Trying to think if I understand that question. So I think that's around entitlements. And I think maybe the question is around like, can you have entitlements that are used internally versus that are for a customer? Like, or I'm sorry, that belong to a vendor. Like, I guess the question would be like, who owns this software maybe? And you can create like custom software models that are for your own products. So, and you could tie that to, you could use the reconciliation engine to tie that to installations. So I may have misunderstood the question, but hopefully that helps.
Got it, thanks. Next question. Install count and license count was grayed out in the CMDB CI SPKG table. Does it fetch data through integrations?
So it will, it was grayed out. Yeah, I think it's grayed out because it's like a summary table. So it's like, yeah, it's like there's some process, right? Like if you run discovery, let's say you don't have SAM Foundation. If you run discovery, it's going to put things in this table. It's going to create these mappings and tie it to this device. So yeah, that's why it's grayed out, because discovery or just anything like the reconciliation engine, it's gonna like update this appropriately. So I'm not exactly sure. I assume if you I haven't really done too much with this. I assume if you could create a record and it would update this count. But yeah, it does. This behaves a little bit differently than the SAM Foundation install table.
Got it. We still have a few more questions coming through from the chat. The next question that came in is there any ability to store securely passwords for various pieces of software and assets being tracked?
I don't think I would store those in, I suppose maybe you could store them in ServiceNow. I think we have like an encrypted field maybe, but I haven't come across that use case. you can store license keys on an entitlement. So I guess like maybe in theory, you could create an encrypted field and store the passwords there. I don't know if that's the best way. I think I would probably look into like a password management solution, just something that's a little more appropriate for that use case. That's sort of how I would approach it, and maybe see about some way of connecting an entry in that to ServiceNow, if that's possible. But yeah, I haven't come across that.
Okay, thanks. And then the next question, if we have SAM Pro, HAM, and Discovery, do all of the normalization engines align to the same convention? In the example, using Dell Incorporated, Dell Inc., etc., does that normalize all to Dell regardless of the engine that grabs it?
Yeah, it should. Kind of behind the scenes, we have another, there's kind of three normalization engines. There's like a company normalization like this normalization data services. So this is part of, I think this is free as well, but basically like we have a way of normalizing companies, and as part of your HAM and SAM implementations, you would typically run that first, and then HAM and SAM are going to rely on that to further do normalization. And like for SAM, there's like the company, but then there's the publisher, and they're not necessarily, there's kind of a link there. They may not necessarily be the same thing. And then for HAM, I think when we do the normalized manufacturer, like it's a company, but there's a sort of a step in between. I don't think it directly references the company table. But yeah, they should all align to the same manufacturer, and a lot of that might be governed by this normalization data services. So if you're struggling with that, check the canonical name of the company and see if that's, if it looks correct.
Got it. Thanks. There's also a few questions related to SAM foundations. Maybe we can cover that a little bit more if possible, Mike.
Sure. Yeah, could you just maybe give me an example of one?
Yeah, so I think there are some questions regarding SAM Foundation and SAM Pro.
Okay, more just the
so going back to that slide, yeah.
Okay, yeah, sure. Maybe this one will be good, just so that everything's kind of in one place. Yeah, I can kind of just walk through the features a little bit differently. So with SAM Foundation, you get some kind of basic reporting. Like you can do reports just with the kind of view run. If you go to reports, view run, we have some there. They're like point in time, basically, is the highlight. Whereas with SAM, we have a bunch of built-in performance analytics reports, and then you also have the ability, like the license, to create your own. You don't need to buy additional performance analytics for that. And the benefit there is it lets you track those values over time. So it's not just a point in time, it'll actually store like what your compliance was in week 12, and you can compare it to week 11, that sort of thing. So with Discovery, like both, you can just integrate with Discovery is going to work regardless of either one. One thing of benefit of having SAM is it's going to normalize the software that Discovery finds. So it's going to like clean up the names, let you match them to a license, really easily without you having to do that yourself. They both have custom license metrics, so you can always create your own ways of measuring usage, but it is a lot of work. You have to look at like the way the vendor thinks about it and understand the different licensing rules. And if you get into like SQL and VMware and the data center stuff, it's a ton of work. Our product team puts a lot of effort into those publishers, and the rules get pretty complicated. So more Discovery sources. I think the main thing here is like with ILMT, like this is a SAM integration, and also Citrix. Like basically, Discovery behaves differently if you have if Professional turned on. It will behave differently with some of these publishers. Like it will collect information about Microsoft or Oracle differently if you have kind of SAM Pro on. So yeah, the normalization engine is big. Just the ability to to reconcile those licenses. One interesting thing would be like around the harvesting. So if somebody's not using a license, SAMPro gives you a workflow to reclaim it and initiate that right from ServiceNow. And we also do that for SaaS applications as well. And yeah, so like I mentioned with the publisher packs, so those are those specific metrics and ways of bringing in data. And yeah, and then just like better together too. So, you know, with change management, we have this feature where if somebody adds cores to like a virtual server, it'll flag that before it happens. So you can maybe prevent it from increasing your licensing costs. We can integrate with like application portfolio management. One of the things that Sam and Ham do is they'll pull in like life cycle dates for the different software and hardware. So if something's going end of life with APM, if you have like your service mapping and everything, it'll kind of show you that in a graphical way. HR onboarding, Annie's gonna tell you all about that in a couple weeks. And also vulnerability. So that would be like, you know, if we pull in the sort of vulnerable items that the vulnerability management looks at. If you have like a vulnerability scanner, it'll pull them in, but it might take a while. But we can pull in the like from the different providers what the different vulnerabilities are. And since we have all of this data about installs that's normalized, we can match them to those items quicker. So it's sort of like a, you know, you can, before the scanners pull things in, we can give you an idea of how bad a vulnerability exposure is. That's our software exposure kind of feature. Yeah, so hopefully this was helpful. I don't know, Mika, if there was anything that they asked about that I missed. I know
yeah, one more question coming through the chat. So if ITAM is being used for discovery, does ITAM have the ability to discover Oracle-enabled license options? And will SAMPro know what to do for the license options in the performance pack?
Yep, that's a great question. So that's a new thing that we got from Oracle. Actually, we were certified for discovery to use it for Oracle database. So it's not every Oracle product, but for Oracle database, like if you got audited by Oracle, you could run the discovery, or we could run discovery rather than deploy their scripts. You have to go to the ServiceNow store and request it's the Oracle GLAS store app, and that will pull in the data that you need for an Oracle audit. And part of that also, it will pull in the usage for the management packs. And I think actually now with the most recent version of Discovery, like you need the Glassdoor app to pull in that data. I think that's something they changed recently. So if you're looking to do that, make sure you have the that store app, but it is free as long as you have Discovery. Yeah.
Hey, Mike, I think there was a question earlier in the presentation, and it was if they currently have ServiceNow Discovery as well as ITSM, if they still need SCCM. Let me just make sure I matched all those correctly. God, there's a long list of questions. It says we have ITSM and Discovery. Will that work instead of SCCM?
Yeah, so I think, well, the first thing I'd say is both things can work together. And it's just sort of like, what's your use case? So the benefit of SCCM is it's an agent. So even if the device is not online, it will still, you know, when the device comes back online, it will report in, whereas Discovery is just going to scan. And if the device isn't online, Discovery is going to miss it. One thing that I wanted to mention was that if you're kind of doing both, if you're discovering the device with Discovery and it has SCCM, you can set this flag to true. And if you set this to true, it won't pull in, Discovery won't create the installs. It'll just, you know, find all the other information about the device, but it's going to let SCCM handle the inventory. And that just prevents you from having duplicates. You could also do like some business rules on the install table and just have your preferred source. So if there's already entries from the preferred source, then don't create any entries from all the other sources. if you have multiple sources that are finding installations, you definitely want to have some kind of way of managing that to avoid duplicates. So hopefully that helped. All right, I know we just have a kind of a few minutes left. I mean, maybe just to sort of sum up, I know I went through a lot of the slides that I was going to show. But yeah, so, you know, we talked about a lot of these use cases. Maybe we can just talk a little bit about kind of what's coming. So we are going to talk about next time the HAM workspace. So I did show you sort of asset management in the next experience, but there's a sort of a whole workspace that we redesigned. And one thing I guess I should mention too is you will get that workspace in the base asset management. It just won't have as many features. And we are going to spend a little bit of time kind of comparing the two. So that's kind of why I said additions here, because you will get the base new workspace with the base asset management. That's one thing. And yeah, we'll just also be talking about the way that you can look at an asset record in a different way. So a lot of good stuff kind of coming up there. And yeah, and so, you know, again, for just basically again, for like the products. So the ones that you have now, you have the base asset now, you have the ability to turn on SAM Foundation, you have the ability to turn on the procurement module, but it's really just, you know, the additional ones would be SAM Professional, hardware asset, and then potentially SAM Enterprise as well. Those are the ones that are an additional cost. Yeah, so I know we just, you know, have a minute left. So I hope that was helpful to everybody. You know, be on the lookout for those additional calls that we're going to be having later this month. And yeah, we'll kind of go from there. Anything from the rest of the ServiceNow team that you wanted to jump in with? All right.
Nope.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Mike.